Welcome to this week's episode of the Digital Drop podcast. I'm very excited to be joined by Beau Ormrod today. And today we're going to be talking about how structural change can make or break a business, and more specifically, transforming an organization with 33,000 employees, and Beau's experience through that process. Beau, welcome to the Digital Drop. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Beau, you describe yourself as a business and executive coach, but I'm very impressed with your career when we initially met. You've worked in financial services, you've done business coaching, you've led large-scale transformation projects. Could you just, for the sake of our listeners, give us a little bit of background as to why you're the person to be talking about how to manage change and transformation in large organizations?
Yeah, of course. So I'll start right from the beginning. So my career has been mainly anchored in financial services,
Yeah.
fintech, payments, and it started at the back end of the 90s.
Okay.
When I remember going for my first job in a big financial institution, because that's what you did in the 90s. You joined a reputable company, and you work your way through that company, understanding the intricacies in the way that the business is structured. And I didn't originally want to get into financial services, but the day I started my role in that big financial company, I knew it was the place for me. And I led this was going to be a 2 or 3 year career, and then what turned out to be a 19-year tenure at that organization.
Wow.
And I progressed through the roles: operations, transformation, leadership. But a lot of my career has always been anchored in process.
Mhm.
And that's where I really carved my teeth in financial services, because, when you hit that note where you know that this is the thing that you were meant to do. And I know that I've been fortunate to find that. But when I found that in financial services, I was hooked. And there I carved out a career right from an early age through to, I still practice all of the process architecture today.
Mhm. So processes, obviously there's levels to complexities within organization. How important are processes for organizations at different levels?
Oh, they're imperative. They're absolutely imperative. If you don't have a process, it's like driving a car with your windshield blacked out and your dashboard lights off. If you don't know the process and where you're going from A to Z, are you really in the space of knowing how to get there? Never mind get there efficiently or effectively. Processes for me are just imperative, because it gives you the grounding works to say that this is how something's going to operate in a sequential steps of getting from A to Z. And once you know that process, you can share that process. So you know it, your team knows it, the business knows it, your customers know it, your suppliers know it, your family know it. And the power of process has always resonated with me. That's what I said. So when I found that space in my career, I knew that this is what I wanted to then carve out a career with. Because once organizations get real intricate with the way that they operationalize process, everything else comes a lot easier, because it then gives you the platform to say, well, how efficient and effective are we within this process? And it's everything from managing people, managing operations, managing projects, programs, strategy. If you can map it through a process and you have a common ground for understanding what that process looks like, it's the foundation of all successful businesses. And I can't tell you, Nesh, the amount of business owners or business senior leaders I've asked to map a simple process. Just something straightforward to say, how do you get your client from a prospect through to sale? How do you understand the way that operationally we help and support clients through a journey? And the amount of times I've done this in a group of where people don't have their process map and ask them to do it, I seldom see them map the same thing, because they all have their own version of what they're doing.
Yeah, I can understand from growing a business from essentially a startup where you've got a handful of people and everybody plays a little bit of everything. As you scale, the need to incorporate certain processes. And uh, like any business owner, we could probably do a better job, and we probably should have done it
Yes.
sooner. Um,
Yeah.
how do you begin the process of defining how do you begin the process of defining a process in an organization where a suitable process does not exist or is not clearly defined. How do you
Yeah.
go through this?
So I'll take a few steps back from there. So there's many ways to kind of skin a cat with this. And process has got many different guises and different frameworks, different methodologies, and a lot of large organizations use very different versions of this. So most people will have come across things like agile, really popular in the technology space. And when you want to move quick, there's Lean Six Sigma, which is where I became the expert. And that's more around the statistical nature of process. So how efficient is the process and how efficient can you get it? So things like aerospace, they run on Six Sigma. And the reason being is because when you start to think about operationally how something works, flight, for example, you want that flight to be as safe as possible. So you can't measure things in performance or process when it comes to things like people's lives. You've got to have the ability to understand how many times can that process go wrong. And in Six Sigma, we call it defects per million opportunity.
Mhm.
And aerospace is a good example of that. And it's understanding that how many times can this thing go wrong in a million times. Now, you'd be glad to hear,Nej, that it's less than 3. It's less than three opportunities per million times it can go wrong,
Okay,
which
so
still is kind of
still a bit
scary when you
higher,
see the amount.
3 too high.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where you need to start with when you're understanding, well, what defines and denotes the way to approach a process. What do you want to get from the end result? How quickly do you need to get there? And then the intricacies then, well, what do you do with the workforce, with the operations, with the larger scale kind of transformation or the technology spaces? These all fit together quite intricately. But I would always start with what's the end game? What do you need this to look like? And how far away are we from it?
Okay, and how would you define what an end game? Because there's different parts, different processes within an organization that leads to different endpoints. So, for example, a sales process, the end game is to win the client. That's not the
Yep.
same process you would utilize to maintain and develop the relationship with that client.
Yep.
So, how do you initially define what the end product is, and
Yep.
to what extent do processes exist in silos, and are they intricate, let's say, interconnected within an organization?
Yeah. So I'd argue with what you said then around the sale is the end game. So the sale is always part of an end game.
Okay.
How you get there and the impact you have on the clients has now become really important. So a lot of big organizations do what's known as customer journey mapping.
Hmm.
How does the customer feel going through that sales process? From
Yeah.
the eyes of the customer, what does it look like? How are they getting through each stage and phase of the process? And does it keep them in a really clear pathway so that they become then that repeat client, that loyal client? And there's so many, it's so multifaceted when you think about the efficiency of a process. The end game and the non-negotiables, what does this absolutely need to do? And it can look really different dependent on the industry. So when you're talking financial services, yes, you're in the space of sales, you're in the space of operational efficiencies, you're in the space of cost reduction. And I have a real interesting kind of concept with cost reduction because it never really is the end game. It's a consideration, but if the idea is to reduce costs, I mean, you can do that in any business. You can reduce all the costs to zero.
Yeah.
But we now know that that business is out of business. So where it comes to the client and understanding what they need the end game to be, it's understanding in order of magnitude, what's the priority, what are the non-negotiables, and then figuring out something as you would as a consultant. So you can come out with a statement of work, you can come out with some objective mapping, you can come out with just some really clear directive from the operation to say, this is absolutely what we need this process to do. And then you work backwards from there.
Okay.
So when I say you work backwards is you then start to think about, well, okay, well, what's in play today? What's the current state? What will it take to get to the future state? And then ordinarily you break that down into the typical structures of the way a program or a project works: people, process, technology. Yeah. Communication has to underpin everything. I cannot stress the importance of really clear, integrated, engaging communication. Because like I said about the process, you'll find that assumption in this case is a real break point for most programs and projects. If everybody can define and articulate what we're setting out to do, the direction we're going in, when you are hit with those kind of side winds, the left field things that always happen in process or project change, then you can deal with it because everybody's on the same page. So project definition is really key. And I'll be honest, this is a lot of where organizations fail because they get real kind of starry-eyed with the size of the prize of what could be possible without predetermining or defining what the problem is that they're either addressing and the direction of travel they're going in and the destination they're going to. So those are really important. And there's so many ways in which you can do that. And you can get really statistical, like I said, with all of the things that we use in Lean Six Sigma. You can get real speedy. Like Agile, for example, is very much built and designed to fail fast, learn quickly, and move on. And then you've got other disciplines that are out there in the mix, like Prince 2, which has been around since the day of time, PMBOK, PMP, PGMP. There's lots of different disciplines that will take the client and the organization on a slightly different pathway. Mm-hmm. But the definition of the project or the process and a really clearly defined outcome is imperative. It's that for me, as a business leader, as a business coach, is a non-negotiable. If you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a lot. We touched upon in the title of this conversation and this episode is talking about structural change within a business and process definition. So do organizations have a certain structure when you are brought in to help lead change and transformation? Do you build a process around an existing culture and should that, around an existing structure, or should it be the other way around? You define a process and then adapt the structure accordingly?
You can do it either way. And as a consultant, I'd assess which way is the best. So if the end game is really clear, but there's already an infrastructure and there are kind of enterprise processes in play, the biggest heel when it comes to these kind of things is technology, like legacy systems. Where's the organization going in the future state with its technology, its platforms, its systems? And a lot of that kind of determines as to how you play the approach with the process. Mm-hmm. So if the end game's clear, for a company in the scale and the size where I was working before I set my business up, technology was a big player in the approach in the end game. And then to galvanize the technology teams, as well as the organization, the operation, the program, and the process teams, it's quite a feat to get those three scalable functions on the same page. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And when you talk about large scale transformation projects, mainly an enterprise process, one of the biggest things that you definitely need to consider is people, because they're the ones who are going to give you first hand, warts and all, how that thing works today, whether it's a big kind of system technology piece or it's a process piece. But you're equally then dependent on those people ordinarily then adopting the new ways of working. And one of the biggest pieces of advice I give anybody heading into big transformation changes: engage early, engage really early. Mm-hmm. Build it with the people that sit behind the operation and the process. They'll know things you just can't find. Even when you go to map the process, they'll tell you how that process works. Yeah. You could map it as to what you think it is, but the reality is often quite different. So the people engagement is just critical, especially when you're expanding over a large workforce and you're looking for that operational efficiency. You've got to get the people involved.
Yeah, I think you're preaching to the choir a little bit there. As you know, we do a lot of digital transformation work with our clients, and one of the constant problems that I feel that most digital transformations fail before they even begin. And there's a statistic out there. There's a number of studies that say anywhere between 70 and 84% of these transformations fail. And when you look at the ones that ultimately fail or don't achieve the objectives, generally the way in which the organization approaches their digital transformation journey, um,
Mm.
in my mind, is what sets it up for failure. And to be more specific, what I keep seeing is this mindset of treating transformation as an event, that being led
Yeah,
by a siloed group of individuals within the organization. And people think that, digital transformation success is about technology and budgets, whereas in reality, in my experience, it's about culture and people. Um,
yeah,
to what extent um, do you think that inclusion, because you've touched upon that with, you've got to speak to the people, you've got to actually understand the processes that are really going on, they're misaligned with what leaders would typically think. Um, but you've also been involved in a process where you're dealing with an organization with 33,000 employees. Obviously, you can't go
yeah,
and include all of those employees in a meeting or any sort of a conversation. So how do you find the
yeah.
balance between having efficiency and somebody driving this process whilst at the same time keeping all the people within the organization involved in that process and thereafter adopting that process? How do you find that balance?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question, Nudge. And you got to start off with a really, really clear vision and measurable objectives that can be shared with the volume like 33,000. Because you do at some point need that engagement, whether it is just an informative session of communication. This is what the organization is going through. This is now what you're going to see things of flavor coming through in your teams, in the functions, in the business units. You've got to have a really clear vision and measurable objectives that you can communicate through strong leadership and stakeholder alignment.
Okay.
And it's having that structure around your program to know who are the people that are the key players within each business division, the function, the teams, and on the ground. And how do you bring them with you and help them with the communications? Because sometimes when they're too far deep in the weeds, they don't necessarily see or get to understand why the business is going in a different strategic direction.
Mhm.
Make it really important and really key that they understand the part that they play, and then the information and the communication that they share is all congruent. And write it in a language that helps them understand. Because as a kind of program lead and as a senior leader for many years, simple, just keep it simple.
Yeah.
Your strategy is only ever as good as your ability to articulate it. And we'll all get wrapped up because we think it sounds cool, because we can give these huge big acronyms and we can give these huge big program directions on how we're going to impact EBITDA and how this is going to create X value of revenue or process efficiencies. It's great, and that'll keep your stakeholders and your seniors happy. But the thing that's really key is that alignment of all the things you're doing in the program and the projects. It's constantly communicated. This is the direction. Does everybody understand? Do some feedback sessions. Do some lunch and learns.
Yeah.
Solicit feedback. I can't, and that's another thing,Nej, that I stress a lot is feedback's so important. And we can all get wrapped up in our own self-importance and how we know what to do, because that's what we're paid to do. That's why we're here to do the job. But feedback around the reality of how this is impacting people is so, so important. And if you prioritize both employee and customer experiences, the success of the program is sixfold likely to be than it would if you was to just head down, blinkers on, and just implement.
Oh, you've touched on an interesting point there about feedback, and that's where I think it goes hand in hand with culture. So I work
Yeah,
with organizations where there's a culture of there's a mindset of it being a flat organization in when it comes to decision making and ideas and feedback. And generally speaking, the bigger and more complex the organization gets, the more political it
mm,
gets, where it becomes very difficult to get actual authentic feedback, either because people are afraid
yeah,
to speak up, people are afraid to disagree, or people are not empowered to give their opinion. Um,
yeah,
is there any hope for organizations with that kind of a culture?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a commonplace then, that's where a lot of organizations have come through that type of culture. But what I'm seeing now is a shift in that. And the shift's been kickstarted, and there's been a catalyst for things like COVID and Brexit, because organizations are now to embrace adaptability and continuous learning rather than lean on and depend on the things that they've always worked in the past. Really effective leadership and collaborative problem solving, yeah, is something that this has been a topic now which has been less taboo and more about the ingraining in the culture, where everybody from top down and bottom up can say what role that they play in then helping the culture of the organization shift. And the ability to then think visionary as a leader, but then combine that with things like pragmatic execution, because things like hybrid working that came into play. And all organizations now are spending quite a considerable amount of money figuring out how do they create that work environment for then this to be the most productive. Yeah. Things like storytelling is now becoming a big thing around how do we then help people through the journey, not just the customer, but the employee. Empathy, massive thing, huge thing in culture of organizations now. And because of the shift and the changes in the way that we view mental fitness, mental health, neurodiversity, which I think is phenomenally good. And we're now getting so much better. There's a ways to go, but we're getting so much better at understanding what drives people. How do we optimize and get the best out of them? But equally, how do we pay that back? How do we help them with things like trust, inspirement, emotional intelligence? I run a program with a neurologist in San Francisco, and we talk about the positive mind,
Yeah,
and how tapping into your positive mindset is more than 80% of the battle of having a really positive, successful, and happy day. And because business now, you can see how business is moving so fast with advancements like AI and health and all of the information bombardment that we're constantly getting on the daily, giving
scary
people the
times.
ability to then, yeah, give people the ability to process that, but give them in a way where they can think about things positively, where things are becoming really clear that how that one impacts the business, but how can they make the most of it? And when you consider organizations of that size, this algorithm becomes really complex, but it's not impossible. It's not, because the first thing we're doing is talking about it. This isn't a done to you. This is a done with you now. And those organizations that do this really successfully, and we can all think of a few, all have a fully encompassing engagement program where they're using data decisions, they're using employee satisfaction scores, they've got an ESG program, they've got a mental health wellbeing program, and they combine it all together, because the people who actually execute the change are the ones that you need to look after. And having all of this together, when I first started out in the back end of the 90s, if I could have told myself now what was coming in the next 25, 30 years, I wouldn't have believed you,
Yeah.
because the culture at those times was very much a top-down corporate structure, and this is what was happening, and this is what we were going to do. But now the value of having everybody involved is just phenomenally good.
Yeah, well, I think you touched upon COVID as an example, and that acted as a
Mm.
huge catalyst to organizations adapting to changing. Even little things like just speaking to your colleagues when they're in their own home environment, seeing the background that they are in, it created a much more human element to these
Yeah,
relationships. But that was a must, right? That was a situation that created whereby you either adapt or you failed, right? Or you cease to exist. So there wasn't so businesses are good at reacting when there's an external force that's forcing that reaction. In a lot
yeah,
of organizations, until that becomes a must, it's not going to be enacted. Uh, and
yeah.
and then there's the other thing about change that I wanted to pick your brain on and understand your opinion. But how do you truly measure success of change or transformation? And I'm going to give you one example in the story from my own experience. But in the early around 2009, I was selling enterprise software into various industries, and I remember
Yeah,
working with a large French manufacturing organization, one of a handful of leading companies coming out of France. And it was a new CMS, new website, new workflows. It was essentially a digital transformation that included new CRM and things like this. Um,
yeah,
they had the biggest budgets, they had the most skilled staff you could imagine, very highly paid individuals, and they bought one of the four leading software technologies across all of their needs in the marketing tech stack. They went with what Gartner recommended at the time. A couple of years later,
yeah,
they implemented a new site. The project came kind of within budget, a little bit late, but all in all, it was celebrated as a great success because the
yeah,
people around it that set the boundaries saw it as a great success. The new site's live, we've got all these new functionalities and so on. I didn't have any dealings with that organization until coincidentally 10 years later, somebody from our organization reached out to me, and now I'm in a different capacity as an agency owner, and they were essentially looking for a new technology to go to implement now a headless content management. But I went to this
yeah,
meeting in the same building that I was 10, 11 years prior. Few of the people were the
yeah,
same people. And at some point, I just got hit with this epiphany. I realized that what they're trying to do and the challenges they're trying to overcome, the vast majority of the conversation was almost identical to the conversation that we'd had a decade ago that was celebrated as success. Yet here we are 10
yeah.
years later looking to blow another couple of million at exactly the same challenge. So, what time frame do you need to look at to understand whether transformation is truly successful? And what metric, how do you actually measure this in reality?
Yeah. What a great question. And equally, I've been back into organizations that I've worked in, and they were all talking equally as well about the stuff that I was talking about when I was there. Like the big, huge cultural transformation changes. How do we help them get that cultural change? And I think that's the beginning of the answer to the question. It's like, what are you trying to change? Because if it's culture, that's a significant challenge to try and get done.
Mhm.
Huge, huge challenge because it bears so many nuances of what needs to happen with a cultural change. And that all starts with the leadership. If they don't live, breathe, talk, walk, and act the culture that they want the company to be in, I can almost guarantee you it will never happen. And even then, it's a difficult request when you think about the size of the organizations that I've worked with. It's a huge shift, huge shift. Then you add in the complexities of things like the way that the digital transformation road landscapes changed, the way that our constant news bombardments, overload of information, the way the world works is in constant change. So to shift culture is incredibly difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult. So I'm going to hold that. If we're talking around enterprise architecture, yeah, that
Yeah,
was a slightly easier algorithm to do because you can look at a point A to B. Yeah.
yeah.
What's the things you need to do for the ability to move from current state A to future state B, and then nuance down and granulate down as far as you need to then make that happen. Roll it back up, create a program timeline, and stick to it. You manage your risks, your raids, all of the right stakeholders, and so on. That's a kind of a static approach, and you can execute that quite pragmatically if you've got the right discipline and the right methodology behind you. Somewhere in the middle, you've got people change.
Mhm.
And this isn't necessarily organizational cultural change, but helping people performance, for example. And one of the things that I did in the previous organization was look at the way we managed performance. Because back in the 2000s, showing my age here, in the banking, let's just call it the banking challenge, of the way that people were told to sell,
Yes.
this ultimately landed the banks in a lot of hot water with the FSA. And this was about decades of that 80s, 90s hardball sell by widgets culture. that was ultimately then put onto the people, and they were then measured by performance. And if you didn't perform, you'd be out of the job, or you'd be on a PIP, or some way of then understanding why you're not hitting this arbitrary ticket number that you've been given. And that obviously came to a crash in around 2008, 2009. And when you look at the people behind that, we're all very similar in the way we're made up. We're all organic, we're all human, but we were kind of put into this environment where we were told to manage by numbers. How many of these did you do? How many of them did you do? How many did you convert? Chalk this up on a board. And that's what we measured success against. But when you think about it, the whole premise and the concept of then why people engage financial institutions like banks and building societies or payments companies is they don't always want, or very seldom actually want, the products. They want the outcome of what the products can give them. For example, nobody wants a mortgage. Everyone wants a house. Nobody wants a loan. They want whatever they're going to purchase with, and so on. So when we talk about people performance and the way that you manage people, it's a slightly different approach, and it's in between that of culture and process. And that's the one where you need to think about qualitative data. And you can use that statistically, because again, that's why I always lean on the more around the lean Six Sigma kind of thing, because you can think then on sample size, what's the typical response? What's the typical outcome? What's the typical way in which this thing, whether it's a performance measure, a sales metric, whatever it is, how is this going to perform? The cool thing we did with that particular project was strip it right back. And rather than manage by widgets and numbers, and at the end of the day, you'd kind of see people, typically with a pen and a piece of paper, like writing down the things that they did in that particular day. We asked, what are you good at? Like, how do you come in the business? What did you get the job for? Why did you come into the organization? And to flip that kind of thing on its head to then say, well, great, why don't we lean on the things you're actually quite good at? Like, you might be great at understanding the way that people love properties because you're into properties, you're into art, decoration, you're into buildings, or it might be that you're into cars. You love talking about motor engines, or you like the way that you like something that people can relate to. And I flipped the whole thing on its head and said, why don't we measure people on what they're good at and give them the data and the numbers and the statistics to say, great, in the last 12 months, looking back across your performance, let me tell you how you did. And we trusted you with what you were doing on that particular day. Like where you sat, who you talked to, the things you talked to clients about, your product knowledge, your service knowledge. And we kind of bundled it together to say, great, do you know what happened on these particular days where your performance and the way that the business measures performance was great? And they tell you, oh, it was a sunny day. Oh, I got to sit next to Mark, and Mark was telling me about this particular property that came on the market. Client came in, they were looking at something similar, and I ended up actually pushing them onto the mortgage company, and we got a £2 million mortgage off it. And just asking them the things that we were asking of them as employees gave us enough rich data to say, great, well, if we lean on you for the things that you're good at, ask you to do more, and say, how can we help you, support you, and inspire you to do more of this thing? What can we give you to equip you and empower you to do it? And then the things when you have the off days, great, we're all human. What can we do to pick you up and help you do something more in the psychology space, behavioral and cognitive things? And flipping the people thing round is something that I really, really is close to my heart, because this is what I did at one of the bigger organizations. And we flipped it from number management to true performance management. And that organization actually saw a 15% uplift in sales because we allowed colleagues to be themselves. And we tooled them and equipped them to being able to do that. And we also actually saw in that particular example a reduction in the variation in performance. So when you're talking commercial and you've got the sales teams that are looking outwardly on where we can head with this, it makes that a hell of a lot easier if we're a lot less variable. If we don't have these spikes and these troughs, because ordinarily we're either product pushing, or there is a seasonality, or there is something which certain product divisions were asking us to do more of this because that's what we've gone out to stakeholders with. That's what we're going to do.
Yeah. So, but this is starting to make a little bit of sense. Obviously, when we met, you're a process guy. You've come from this corporate background in leading transformation in very complex, and I would argue maybe not the sexiest of sectors and organizations. But then you've moved
Yeah.
into coaching and personal leadership, and I find this very fascinating because somewhere along the way, you've clearly had a few epiphanies and realized that doesn't matter if the processes are good or not. If the people and the mindset driving them is not where it needs to be, then it's not going to be
Yeah.
successful. Tell me a little bit more about what drove you to go from that corporate background to something that's bordering on the realms of psychology and mindset coaching, so to speak.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I think the first thing was that 3-year career that I planned at the back end of the 90s turned out to be a 19-year career. And working with the kind of the big four consultancies and some of the other key players in big transformation programs, you kind of get to see the way that they work. And they're amazing. They're very clever at what they do. You pay a pretty penny for that type of service as a big consultancy. But as I've been in that space of building and leading large scale transformation programs, mainly in enterprise process, but I have done the stuff in the people and performance framework, like I mentioned. I wanted to transition all of that knowledge into either my own consultancy and bring in the element of coaching. Because Nedge, I've always gravitated towards coaching. And the reason is I do believe that just as professional athletes kind of rely on coaches to reach peak performance, business leaders deserve the same advantage. And people in organizations deserve that level of help, of having help that tells them and helps them become the person they're meant to be. And I do believe that we've got this new wave of senior leaders that even with just slightly better tools and slightly better information will get drastically better results. And because of that, they'll live totally different lives. And it'll have an amazing impact on their lives as business leaders, business owners, their family, their friends, their customers, their suppliers, the community. And that's what led me in to building my own consultancy and coaching practice, because I'm really passionate about helping people become what they're meant to be.
That's a very powerful answer, and I can see the passion coming through. So kudos to you for making that leap. And yeah, as a
Thank you.
business owner myself, I often use this analogy. We're so in the thick of it on some days, trying to keep everything moving, sometimes fighting to keep the ship afloat. And
Yeah.
it feels like we're in the fog. And I often use the analogy that sometimes we need to climb on the mountain to kind of take stock and actually see where we are in order to understand where we want to go. We touched upon
Yeah.
vision, purpose, and a lot of people see these as buzzwords and they hear them, and there's a lot of content out there talking about this. But and what my vision was when I started my business a few years in, it changed. The business changed, the direction changed, the purpose, the core values. Um,
Yeah.
so I completely get that. If I'm in a good place and I'm focused on where I want to go, the business seems to follow. To
Yeah.
what extent does good leadership dependent on other aspects of life outside of somebody's job? So from my personal experience, if my exercise is on point, if I'm having good quality time with my children, if I'm eating well, sleeping well, I'm a lot more focused and find it easier to lead my organization through whatever challenge we're going through. Uh,
Yeah.
when you deal with that, to what extent are you dealing with what somebody's job role is and career, and to what extent are you looking at their entire life and how they live their life?
Yeah. Both are hand in hand. Absolutely. And a good mindset for a leader, they have particular traits that I see in them.
Hmm.
But to understand them intricately is the first part. So everything I've ever done with coaching, so as a client, as a precursor, is understanding them deeply as a person.
Hmm.
And I touched on the neurology side of things because that's more about the mindset of where somebody's head is. Do they ordinarily live each day in kind of true happiness, or are they self-sabotaging? And we all sabotage ourselves, by the way. And there's plenty we can do to then either kind of catch that and prevent that. And that's a whole thing that I take particular leaders through, because as adults, we go through a very difficult transformation, becoming the kind of the young nipper as everything was amazing and the world is such a beautiful place. And ordinarily, we don't have much as a kid. But then as you grow up and you realize that it's a complex, very difficult to navigate world, we build up these saboteurs in our head. So when I talk about business leaders or transformational leaders, the ability to understand them intricately as a person is absolutely critical. And then we talk about, well, what do they want to get from this? Like, what is their overarching objective? And are they clear around what that looks like in the future? So are they good at visioning? Can they story tell? Have they built a pathway to say that in 10 years time, 5 years, 2 years, 12 months, they're looking at me from across the table, or most of the time across a virtual thing like Zoom or Teams, it's successful. And that's where we start. Like, are you in the right headspace, neurologically, psychologically, behaviorally, cognitively? And as a good coach, it's my job to put them on some rails rather than a road where it's very easy to digress and kind of procrastinate onto the sexy thing that's over there, or something else to come along and it just seems to be the thing that everybody's doing that's making them a fortune, so we should do that. All business success and all leadership success has always been on rails, and you know exactly where you're going. You can see the destination regardless of how far it is in the future, and then you build your plan. What stops do you want to take along the way? Which stations do you want to stop off at? And pick up further intelligence, knowledge, insight, research, take a break. Really important. But I will always keep anyone who's in this space on those rails and get you from A to B. And if that's a week, we'll get you from A to B in a week, and then we reset. If it's a year, 2 years is probably, if I'm honest, that's where I play. I think trying to think further than 2 years is quite difficult.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'll challenge anybody to think, yeah, could you imagine where you were 2 years ago? And I think you've just said it. So 2 years ago, are you where you expected to be today? And if the answer is yeah, phenomenally well done. But there's so many different nuances and left field things that come in 2 years. I think 2 years is a good benchmark.
Tony Robbins' quote comes to mind, and that is, you've got to be very clear on your destination, but you've got to be adaptable on your journey, how to get there. So yeah, I think anything more than 2 years, it's impossible to plan, and you need to deviate from that. But having that North Star, so to speak, and focus, it's certainly been the only thing that's kind of kept me going in some sort of a direction towards what I wanted. We could go into this into so much detail. I find it really fascinating speaking to you, Beau. But you've worked with a lot of leaders. You're a leader yourself. Is there any common characteristics that you see between successful leaders versus the not so successful leaders? You know, what commonalities and common traits stand out with when you first engage with somebody where you feel, okay, this person I can work with, this person's going to be a real challenge?
Yep. Authenticity. Top of the list.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because we're all different and we all have very different styles. And I'm sure most of your listeners will be familiar with DISC. So the ability to know, understand the kind of the type of character somebody might be in the dominant, influential, steady, conscientious type. And knowing that, and then when leaders come to me for an element of coaching, you see the ones that are either being authentic, genuine, and truly want to do something in that space, or whether this is and I hate the quote, but a tick box exercise. Can we do this because we've been given some ESG or a particular target with the organization that we need to do some personal or professional development? And the things that set aside and the traits of a really successful leader are those who are quite visionary and are not afraid to share that vision, as wild as it might seem. If they truly hand on heart believe that this is the way that the business, the organization is capable of going, the fun bit, and this is where I come in, is helping them build the tracks to get there. and doing everything that you can from a organizational perspective, from a process, people. We can build many different models to be able to get there in a really sequential, steps changed way. And then as you go along that, build in the psychology, the neurology. And then when you start to see those incremental changes into the direction that you're heading in, you get the best thing of all the change, which is momentum. And then all of a sudden, everybody's jumping on. That's what they call it, jumping on the bandwagon, because they see the success. But if someone's had the strength to first of all set that vision and not waver from that and start to move forward, fail sometimes because it doesn't work the way you expect, or because you might be going on a pursuit that nobody's ever done before. Things a bit like AI. There's a lot of things banded around AI at the moment. And those organizations that are going to embrace that are going to be the ones that find that golden nugget first. And there's a few things that I'm doing in that space that we're starting to see some of that shine through around practical applications of AI, where not just the kind of the digitization or the automation, but using things like predictive analytics, using a balance of technology and human. So there's a real element of hybrid humanistics in AI at the minute, which I'm really working with. But in answer to the question, it's those strong, solid, authentic, genuine leaders. They're the ones which get everybody galvanized and take them on their journey with them.
Yeah, I love the main point you made, authenticity, because yeah, there's nothing worse than dealing with people that drink too much of their own Kool-Aid or are constantly smoke and mirrors and trying to portray this image that you know is incongruent with what's behind that image. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I really like that answer, and I couldn't agree more. Um, if we touch upon AI, I think that in itself is a conversation we could go into for hours, but there's a lot of fear at the moment because AI is in its, well, it's not in its infancy. AI has been around since 1966 was the first time when the phrase
Yeah.
was termed, but it's now become so accessible and so capable that
Yeah.
there's a lot of uncertainty and excitement about what AI can do. So yeah, we're experimenting with a lot of things. So many of them are very gimmicky and will not result in anything. But every so often you have a eureka moment and realize, hey, that thing that we used to spend weeks on, we could actually
Yeah.
reduce that to 2, 3 days. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I suggest we delve a little bit deeper into that on a separate conversation. But just since we've touched upon it, what's the most exciting bit in AI that you feel is going to help leaders drive transformation?
So the practical applications of AI are coming through quite thick now. And I have a sister company at Focal Point that built that predictive analytics model that it's trained a bot. We've coined and trademarked the term straight shot bot because we've all had to play with ChatGPT and Claude and a few of the other tools that generate images and that kind of thing. But you can teach AI tools with varying different plugins and APIs and different creativity tools to be able to then do the things to which it would take ordinarily weeks, months to do. And I'm currently working on, and I've got a beta version of a straight shot bot, is the trademark term. And it's trained as a marketing and sales professional to help businesses and organizations understand who their ideal client is. And a lot of companies have come across the notion of, well, who is my ideal client? And I always use the same example in this particular thing of am I allowed to say branded names on the
You're allowed to
podcast?
say whatever you want. There's no restrictions here.
All right. So I always use the example of North Face.
Hmm.
Everybody knows who North Face are.
Yeah.
Everybody's either got a jacket or knows somebody with a jacket. And I always say, do you know who North Face's ideal client is? And I get the usual answer, like it's going to be outdoorsy, someone in the fields or someone doing some sort of like endurance thing. And it's actually an ice climber.
Okay.
And I always say, well, how many people do you know with a North Face jacket? And you get the typical answer, yeah, most people. I know quite a few. And I'm like, how many ice climbers do you know?
Yeah.
And not many people know many ice climbers. But the reason I use that example is because it gives you a distinguished difference to saying that when you know who your ideal client is, it puts you on a platform to being able to then have market analysis, client research, niche opportunities, and then things like your branding, your messaging, your communications. Everything you do in the business is then aimed at the crosshairs of that ideal client. And it helps you do a number of things. One is it helps you stand out from the competition. If you was to come back from a cold, wintry day, got straight onto ChatGPT or Google and said, I want a warm coat, there are thousands of companies, businesses that make warm coats. Only a few really stand out.
Yeah.
And they stand out because they do something different to the competition. But it's the ability to know, well, who is my ideal client and what can I build a brand and what can I build a business around that will differentiate me in the space of warm coats. And that's how they end up with it. And that's the one thing that technology and the likes of AI is really helping my client base, because we're doing that differentiate analysis to say, if you are in this sector, this field, what is your differentiate? Like, who is your ideal client? And it doesn't mean to say you don't serve anybody else, just like 99% of people who own a North Face jacket don't go climbing ice. It just
Yeah.
means you stand out. It
If you,
gives you that leverage in that. Yeah.
if you'd have asked me the same question, I would have never said ice climbers. I would have said teenagers, just because I literally went shopping for a coat with my 12-year-old daughter, and she wanted a North Face for no other reason than every other kid's got a North Face
Yeah.
coat.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, it's yeah, great example. And I'm keen to learn more about this co-pilot or this marketing assistant, and see what it can do. Um,
Yeah.
so there's one thing that I just always, we've talked about the challenges, the problems, the negativities, but I always like to wrap these conversations up with some practical advice. So there's a lot of leaders out
Yes.
there that might be struggling with their vision, realize their businesses have got tons of challenges, or undertaking a digital transformation. What are
Yeah.
the top three bits of advice that you would give them that they can do today to either take stock on whether they're on the right path, or to help them define the right path? Just three bits of constructive, practical advice that leaders can walk away with straight after listening to this conversation.
Yeah, of course. So I think the first thing is immediately recognize that you need to create a clear and compelling vision. And that's no mean feat to do.
Hmm.
And ask around, get people to help. People in your immediate kind of peripherals, ask them what this might mean. Test it on them. If you can recite and articulate your compelling vision and everybody understands what that is a huge step forward. Because what you find then is you gather momentum and everybody says the same thing of what your business is set out to do, whether that's in the pub, because they're on pub talk, whether that's in the park and the football field, whether that's just in passing and networking events. It's critical you've got a really clear, compelling vision. And then engage employees, stakeholders, possible clients, your friends, your family. Engage them really early in the process and throw the crazy ideas in. Don't assume that they know what you do. The biggest reason, this is another thing I teach, the biggest reason you don't have enough customers by a million miles is because they don't know what you do. Engage them. Yeah. Start communicating that. Make it really easy to understand. Make it simple. Tell a story. And then to help you as to grow the business and to know that you're on them tracks and you're going to the destination and you're using that as a method, use data. Yeah. Measure progress, because what gets measured gets done. And if you've got an organization with just yourself, if you're a solopreneur, or if you've got 33,000 employees, what gets measured gets done. Goal setting. We've all come across that goal setting. Write it down. There is a psychological advantage of physically with a pen and paper, write that down and write that down daily. And as you go, when you get these left field or these kind of nuanced things that then kind of knock you off the rails somewhat, you can adjust your strategy as needed, because you're still aiming at that pinpoint laser focused direction forward. And my last bit of advice is get some external eyes and ears. Yep. Get
Yeah,
somebody to help you that's not ingrained in the weeds day in, day out, and get somebody to come and look a bird's eye and overview and give you those directions, just to just gently coerce you in this way, nudge you in the direction this way, and give you some insights that then will help develop that momentum, that acceleration to your goals.
great stuff. I can certainly agree with the last one. From my personal experience, sometimes our ego prevents us from asking for help or thinking that how can somebody external help me create a vision, but it's exactly that's been a transformational part in my personal journey about 3-4 years ago when I brought in external help to verify what it is that I'm trying to do. So um, Bo, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I think, like we've touched upon, I'd love to get you on for another episode to delve a little bit deeper into the neurology and psychology side of things. But we're going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for your time. A really interesting conversation, and I look forward to our next one.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Likewise, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.